The worst thing that happened to me, or almost happened to me, is my parents wanted me to skip a grade because it was back in the space race. And if you were offered the opportunity to skip a grade, that meant you were going to work for NASA. I showed up at UCLA at the age of 17, and I was way too immature to handle the alcohol and the pressure of it all. Start them a year later, try and create greater incentives to get more men in primary and secondary, high school and elementary school, more vocational programming. There's just a ton of jobs in the real economy for specialty construction, specialty nursing. Anyone who's renovating a house knows that a roofer makes really good money, much less a plumber. And stop shaming those jobs, start elevating them. I think we have to level up young people in general. There's been an enormous transfer of wealth from young people to old people. Specifically, people under the age of 40 used to control 19% of the GDP in terms of their wealth. It's been cut to 9%. The average 70-year-old is 72% wealthier than they were 40 years ago. The average person under the age of 40 is 24% less wealthy. And that affects women and men, but it's disproportionately affecting men because men are fairly or unfairly evaluated from a mating perspective based on their economic viability. Best example of, I think, that depicts this, the greatest innovation in history wasn't the iPhone or a semiconductor, it was the American middle class. Fought wars, pushed back on fascism, paid an enormous amount of taxes, was innovative, came up with DARPA, came up with vaccines, came up with GPS. And where it all started was 7 million men returned from World War II, and they demonstrated excellence in uniform. And the government said, we're going to make a massive investment in them in terms of the GI Bill and the highway construction bill. We're going to give them economic viability. And quite frankly, they were just very attractive. And they had an easier time finding mating, finding a house, two-car garage, and it set off the baby boom. And it set off a generation of confident, loving kids who were comfortable and said, all right, it's time for civil rights. It's time to bring women into the workforce. It's time for women's rights. And it just set off this kind of, post-World War II, liberal, progressive society, the likes of which we've never seen that type of prosperity. But the middle class is an accident. It doesn't self-sustain. The incumbents and people on the far right will claim that the middle class is a self-repairing organism. It's not. It's an anomaly. Middle classes have never existed in society before. We figured it out. But unless you have economically and emotionally viable men, you can't have a middle class. So the question is, how do we level up young men? And I don't think you can just have affirmative action for men. I think that's too political. But I do think we have to put more money into the pockets of young people who have seen a transfer of wealth. And I'll touch a third rail here. Every year we transfer $1.5 trillion. The greatest economic transfer in history happens every year from young people to the wealthiest generation in history, senior citizens, and it's called Social Security. And it just is insane that this group that has consistently seen their wealth and on an inflation-adjusted basis, their livelihood go down and down and down, transfer money to the wealthiest population in the world.